Hello internet, we both know why you're here. This is going to be how to do the scars for Thor, Soldier 76, and Zuko. I picked these characters because the methods used for imitating the scars from these characters can be used for a lot of other characters. First up is Thor. I start with black paint on a little beauty blender type looking thing. You can also use like a regular makeup sponge or even a brush. I had a reference photo up for Thor and I just kind of followed the basic shape of how his wound looked. If you have oily skin like I do, then over time the oils on your eyelids are going to make the paint crease, which is why we want to go ahead and set this with powder. So I took a black eyeshadow and I tried to pack as much black pigment onto my eyelid as possible to prevent creasing in the future. On a small eyeshadow brush, and I again used the reference image and just kind of really lightly, and this is kind of watered down. I then took a small eyeshadow brush and used Mehron Paradise paints in red. And I like to leave it kind of watered down for something like this because a lot of the time you're kind of playing with it and it's okay if it looks kind of smoky and a little bit messy and a little bit like, like normal watercolor paints. And again, constantly looking at the reference image, I kind of lightly made the general shape of where I thought the red would be. And then here's kind of a little trick that I like to use. If there's an eyeshadow color that I really like that I want to use with a body paint, I use 99% alcohol and I basically drench the eyeshadow cake and it kind of turns the eyeshadow into an alcohol paint. I mean, when it dries, it's still gonna be eyeshadow and it could still be smudged and whatnot, but it'll give you really nice pigment during application and it essentially temporarily turns it into a paint. So I did the alcohol thing onto this brown eyeshadow. And I used a makeup sponge that I had kind of picked the ends off of so that it basically made kind of like a stipple sponge. And I rubbed the stipple sponge into the brown eyeshadow and then I kind of started making this blurry kind of brownish burnt edge. So I knew that there's kind of this weird kind of like scratchy orangey color that is around the entire thing. So I knew that I wanted to use a detail brush. I tried out something with just plain orange from Mehron Paradise paints, but it looked a little too cartoony. So then I mixed in some red, also Mehron Paradise paints, into the orange to kind of make this more burnt color with my detail brush. And I first applied kind of these stripes where I saw them in the reference photo. I'll try to point them out so you can see what I'm talking about. It's almost like there's these tiny little, like, it almost looks like, I don't know, like a skid mark or something. I thought that it would look best if I initially go in a little too strong with the orange, and then you can go in with a stipple, like, like a makeup sponge with the edges picked off, so we have kind of that stipple sponge again, and just take one of those sponges with just water on it, no paint on it, and just kind of like dab away to kind of soften the effect. I imagine that they lightly taped his eyelid down so that way his good eye could be open completely without it looking strange. I don't know, there's kind of like that weird kind of funky fuzzy effect that they did to his eyelid, so you can't really see what's going on there. And on to the next look, which is going to be Zuko from The Last Airbender. I used liquid latex from Cinema Secrets onto a makeup sponge, and again, always having a reference photo up, I then made kind of the general shape of the bottom of Zuko's scar, which ended up being kind of this like crescent moon shape. And then I used toilet paper and started tearing just kind of some little pieces. Once I had a layer down, then I added some more latex, and I tried to kind of messy up the tissue a little bit so it looks like there's a little more texture going on there. And I repeated this for the rest of Zuko's scar shape. Be careful not to put latex too close to your eye because remember, you are going to have to peel this stuff up. A lot of the time liquid latex kind of has a strong ammonia smell, and luckily this one didn't smell too bad. Just kind of a random fact, probably the best smelling liquid latex for me has been mask latex, which has virtually no smell. And then you either wait for the liquid latex to dry, or you can do what I do, and I usually just get a blow dryer, and that'll help things along a little bit. The tool that I'm using to kind of messy up the tissue a little bit, it is a silicone tipped sculpting tool, actually. I usually use it for whenever I am sculpting prosthetics. Since I am a very impatient person, I did not completely wait for this to completely set. Liquid latex begins white, and you'll know when it's dry, when it's essentially clear. Sometimes it looks a little bit yellow, But I basically just waited until the very top layer was completely dry and I could safely use a brush on the top of this without worrying about getting liquid latex into my brush. So now we're going to use some alcohol paints. I used the Skin Illustrator Onset palette. It is the flesh tone palette. And for kind of a base layer, I used kind of this brownish tone called LAO2. You'll notice that these colors are like really light, and the main purpose of using something like alcohol paints is you don't want them to be very pigmented like you would with water paints. The point is that you do really light washes layered on top of each other to get the effect that you want. A lot of the time too, when you're using alcohol paints, you're going to bounce back and forth with using the same colors just because the layered effect is going to give you the depth that you want. I bounce back and forth between using LAO2, which is again that kind of brownie color, and a slightly lighter version of it called LAO1. My first job was to kind of get rid of that white pigment and make it look more like scar tissue. Also, fun fact, I would not use a brush that you are super attached to when it comes to alcohol paints so I found out if you use alcohol paints a lot, like with the same brush, the alcohol will actually eventually cause the adhesive that's holding the bristles into the brush to release. It's basically going to destroy the adhesive that's holding your brush bristles in. I lost one of my favorite brushes that way. I then got one of our makeup sponge stipple brush thingies. And I used a little bit of, it's an even deeper brown called cedar brown to just kind of intensify the darker areas. We're shortly going to put some light brown eyeshadow onto my eye because we want the darkest point of this to be from the center, like from your eye, and then extending from your eye, you want it to gradually get lighter. I kept looking at my reference photo and like you can't deny like the kind of pinky tones. So I took some really watered down rose adjuster and I got our little stipple sponge and I just really lightly went over the entire thing with my rose adjuster. And this is where we go in with that brown eyeshadow. Something to keep in mind as well is that your eyeshadow is going to behave differently depending on the surface that you place it on. So it's going to look more intense on your skin, it's going to hold better onto your skin, but if you try to apply that same brown eyeshadow onto the latex and onto the alcohol paints, it is going to not give you the same pigment. So what I ended up doing here is kind of that little alcohol paint trick that we did before. I'm going to take the 99% alcohol and I'm going to put some onto my brown eyeshadow so that way I can get the same pigment onto our latex that I got on my eyelid. And again, if it comes on too intense, then you could always just go right back in with alcohol. These paints can be removed with 99% alcohol, which by the way, I always hear, oh, they can only be activated with 99% alcohol. They will not be activated with 91%, but you will probably quickly find out that it's kind of difficult to find 99% alcohol. Like for most of us, we can only get it by ordering it online. It's way easier to find, like you could find 91% alcohol, probably at something like a beauty supply store or like at a pharmacy. So for about a year there, I was only using 91% alcohol with my Skin Illustrator palette, and you know what? I got pigment just fine. I went ahead and I used the same brush that I just used for the eyeshadow, like the alcohol eyeshadow, and I basically just put just straight alcohol onto this brush and kind of lightly just kind of tapped around and tried to soften everything out so it blends into itself. And it's totally okay if sometimes you remove just like a little bit too much and then you just have to reapply a layer. It happens. I then started using like various tools. The lightest color in the Skin Illustrator Flesh Tone palette, which is rice paper. It's almost white. It's like a very, very, very light skin tone. And first I used a detail brush to kind of touch on the highest points, where all of the bumps and the ridges are. I then used our stipple sponge thingy with some rice paper as well to just very lightly tap on it to again bring out some of those higher points. If you know how I remove something like this, I use a brush with short but stiff bristles and some stuff called isopropyl myristate, and it's basically like this really concentrated oil. It reminds me a lot of like melted like coconut oil, and you just drag a brush that's like soaked with it right along where you're pulling up the prosthetic and it just kind of falls right off. If you're like me and your skin is pretty sensitive to doing stuff like this, especially if you're doing stuff like this regularly and your skin is really taking a beating, it is much wiser to use something like isopropyl myristate and to properly moisturize your skin rather than just ripping it off, because over time you will damage your skin. This last one is the easiest, and again, like, this is one that you can use for really any character. I'm using this for Soldier 76 type scars, but I mean, like, with this neat little doodad we're about to use, you can use it with really any character. And that stuff is going to be Rigid Collodion. And I'm gonna show you exactly what that is in a minute. Really quickly though, we're gonna map out the scars that we want. Just for kicks, I used my alcohol paints, but you know what? I've also used eyeliners, I've also used lip pencils. But this is just Coral Adjuster from the Skin Illustrator palette on a detail brush. Once I have my scar mapped out, then we're gonna take this little bottle, and Rigid Collodion is essentially like this liquid that you place on your skin, and as it dries, it shrinks into kind of like this plastic type surface, and as it shrinks, it pulls your skin in, and when it pulls your skin in, it gives an excellent illusion of a scar. One layer can do something really nice and subtle, but why would we stop at one layer, right? So as you add on more layers, it's going to have like a deeper and deeper effect. Here's just kind of one layer. You can already kind of see how it sort of pulls the skin in. Ultimately though, I ended up doing about 5 or 7 layers. I will say too, the smell for this is pretty similar to nail polish. So if you have like sensitive eyes, it might make your eyes water just a little bit. After I had as much collodion as I wanted down, and I kind of had, you know, some nice depth to start with, then I used some really light makeup. Here I used rice paper to kind of outline around the edges really lightly to kind of bring out that depth more, so you can see it a bit more clearly, like more from a distance. Soak this stuff in warm water, like take a damp washcloth, and the edge will, you know, on its own begin to drag up. It's a bit faster though too. You can actually pretty easily find the edge and it'll just pull right off with no issues. And there we go. I hope that you learned something new from this and there's some really useful information and you feel edumacated. Whatever day it is, I hope you're having a good one, and I will see you the next time I do video stuff. Bye.